Pleasure to welcome you to several commentaries about Taiwan's local elections on Saturday. These were contests for city mayors, county magistrates, and positions all the way down to the very lowest levels of the Taiwan political system. And most media attention, however, has been directed at what happened at cities and counties. And basically, there was a flip between the ruling party, the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, and the opposition party, the Kuomintang, or the KMT. The DPP went from 13 jurisdictions out of 20 to 6, and the KMT went from 6 jurisdictions out of 20 to 13. An independent candidate won the race in the capital city of Taipei. These local elections wouldn't merit much attention around the world if it were not for China. And China has very different views of the current ruling party, the DPP, and the current opposition party, the KMT. Basically, it likes the KMT much more than it likes the DPP. And so one might interpret the results here as being good for China and reflecting a desire on the part of Taiwan voters to improve relations with China, or it might not. My guest for this segment is Dr. Shelley Rigger. She is the Brown Professor of Political Science at Davidson College in Davidson, North Carolina. She's also the Assistant Dean for Educational Development. And for us, the important thing is that she is probably this country's leading expert on Taiwan domestic politics. Shelley, welcome to the discussion.
Thanks. I'm glad to be with you.
Let me start out by asking you, what are the 2 or 3 most important things that people should understand about the results of these elections?
I think the number one takeaway for me from this election is that Taiwanese voters, by and large, are pretty conservative. And I think we've always known that. But it's easy to get caught up in the excitement of the kind of most progressive end of Taiwan's political spectrum, which tends to be very well mobilized and charismatic and outward facing. So they get more than their share of international attention. But the kind of core tendency in the electorate is pretty conservative and pretty cautious. And that came through very strongly in this election. The other thing I would say is that this is not an election about cross-strait relations. It's not a kind of message to Beijing, we want a radically different policy toward cross-strait relations. On the other hand, though, I think in some ways it should serve as a reminder to folks on the mainland that their worst fears about Taiwan being a very progressive and kind of anti-China electorate are not justified, right? This was affirming what we've also known for a long time to be true, which is that Taiwanese voters are pretty centrist, pretty moderate on the full spectrum of issues, including cross-strait relations. So I think those are, that's really one big takeaway, that Taiwanese voters are pretty conservative, pretty middle of the road.
Picking up on that point, I should note that in addition to the elections for offices, there were also a number of referenda that were held. And for me, the results of those referenda seem to confirm your point about conservatism and pragmatism. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. There were kind of 3 big categories of referenda in this election. One was a bunch of things related to marriage equality. And in a nutshell, the ones that were pushing a more progressive agenda were all unsuccessful, and the ones that were pushing a more conservative agenda on marriage equality were successful, with a kind of compromise in the middle, which is the voters did affirm the idea of civil partnership for same-sex couples. So the idea that if you just put marriage equality before the voters, they would affirm it, that message is decisively defeated, I think, in this set of elections. And it's kind of unfortunate because the threshold for the victory or defeat of a referendum question is quite low now in Taiwan. But you know, the DPP changed the law to set it up so that it would be easier to pass a referendum, not realizing that the result of the referendum that they put forward, or that some more progressive activists put forward, would making that low threshold would make it easier for their ideas actually to go down, as well as potentially easier for them to be affirmed. The second set of referendum had to do with energy. And there were there was one about coal, trying to reduce the use of coal, that did succeed, but the voters did not vote down nuclear power. In fact, they voted up nuclear energy. So that, again, was a kind of slap in the face to longstanding DPP focus on an anti-nuclear or phasing out nuclear energy. And then the third sort of category that the referenda fell into was just this one referendum: should we change the name we use in the Olympics from Chinese Taipei, which is the name that Taiwan negotiated that allows Taiwan to participate in the International Olympic Committee and the Olympic Games, to Taiwan. And this is very much the kind of nationalistic idea that some folks in Taiwan imagine could change Taiwan's international status. And that one was also decisively shot down. So essentially, the marriage equality, the anti-nuclear, and the name change, all three things that we would associate with traditional DPP side, although these were not necessarily DPP sponsored, but they're aligned with traditional DPP policy positions, all were defeated.
In the United States, we talk about a wave election with respect to the House of Representatives especially, and a normal election where the factors in each individual district or state are more important. Would you say that for Taiwan's local elections, this was a wave election or a sort of jurisdiction by jurisdiction set of contests?
I think it's a little bit of both. There is certainly always a local component to these elections. And if you look at some of the candidates, some of the ways that there were sort of complicated factors in the elections, additional candidates from one party or the other, or one kind of tendency or the other. Mm-hmm. And if you think about some of the most high profile elections, like the Kaohsiung mayoral election and the Taichung mayoral election, I think there's certainly a strong component of local politics there, you know, people being ready for new leadership, wanting, you know, Kaohsiung has been ruled by the DPP for 20 years. This new candidate came up who's not very ideological. He didn't really campaign as, oh, I'm the traditional KMT. Is much more of a kind of populist, self-made or self-proclaiming political figure, much like the successful candidate, the independent candidate in Taipei City. So there definitely is an element of local political dynamics playing themselves out here. So in that sense, a normal election. But I think there's a little bit of a wave component too. And partly I see that just in the fact that the KMT did not lose a single incumbent mayor. The DPP lost a bunch of incumbent mayors. And also the reach of the partisan shift goes beneath the most high-profile races. So the most high-profile races are the mayoral elections, the ones for the executive positions. But if you go below to the city and county council elections, what you see is the KMT picked up a few seats. They did slightly better. I've calculated sort of back of the envelope yesterday, around a third. They picked up about a third of a seat on average in the city council. So that's not great. You know, that's not a huge wave for the KMT. But the DPP lost a lot of city council seats, and most of them went to independents, obviously, if not to the KMT. But a handful went also to the New Power Party. So I think it's less of a wave for the KMT, maybe, than a rebuke of the DPP. So I think it's a little of both. But I think normally I would want to say it's a normal election, but I think in this case there's no way to look at what we know so far and not see this as a message to the DPP.
Thanks. Could you talk a little bit about the Taipei mayor race? Mayor Ko Wen-je was running for re-election. He's an independent. He's something of a populist. And the feeling in Taipei before the election was that if he does well, as people assume, then that would position himself to run for the presidency against Tsai Ing-wen in 2020. But in the event, he just barely squeaked through. Is he less of a hot commodity now than he was before the election?
That's a great way to phrase that question. I think he probably is less of a hot commodity, but I think what's really, really striking here is the return of the blue voters, so the KMT leaning and KMT affiliated voters to the KMT in this race, that they were able to almost, well, in fact, the KMT candidate, Ding Shozhong, is calling for a recount, and he's trailing by about 3,000 votes out of well over 1 million. So I think, yeah, over 1 million. He probably should call for a recount, actually. Certainly in the US, that would be a reasonable thing to do. So I think what the DPP went into this thinking is that they needed a candidate because they didn't want to just cede Taipei to the independent. I don't think they were expecting that their candidate would fall below 20% and really not be be competitive at all, and that it would be a tight race between the KMT and Mayor Ke. So I think it is evidence that given the opportunity to kind of return to their partisan roots and given a candidate that they felt okay or even positive about, those KMT voters in Taipei City were quite ready to move away from the kind of third way and back into the fold of their sort of traditional partisan alignment. And the KMT also did really well, as we would expect, in the Taipei City Council elections, which will also make life more difficult for Mayor Ke, because those KMT councilors should be emboldened by this result to not necessarily go along with Ke, but to see him as someone, you know, they can kind of squeeze looking to the future.
What can you say about turnout? One interpretation of the 2016 presidential election was that a lot of KMT supporters stayed at home. Did they return to vote? How does generally the turnout for this election compare with past ones?
I don't know the exact percentage, but I know that the turnout was very high, unexpectedly high. So there were long lines in some places. You know, the Central Election Commission chairman has resigned because basically they weren't ready for this high turnout. And that's not surprising because it is a midterm election. It was strictly a local election. This is not like our midterms where we have legislative elections as part of the midterms. These were only local elections. So would it be as if, we were electing state governors, state legislatures, and on down in the US only? So to have such a high turnout is surprising. And I think what that means is we have to take these results very seriously, right? That this many people came out to send whatever message it is that you want to take away. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't because people were disinterested. So I think definitely KMT voters wanted to send the message that, the KMT is not dead, which is something that a lot of people wanted to say after 2016. And they, I think, also maybe saw some more interesting and appealing candidates than they had in previous rounds of election. Ding Xiuzhong in Taipei is a much better candidate than Sean Lien, who was the KMT candidate last time around. The candidate in Kaohsiung City, for whatever reason, really galvanized a lot of people, especially KMT voters. So, I think the KMT came out. The one thing that's been hypothesized, and again, we won't know until we can really look carefully at the breakdown county by county and also ultimately some post-election surveys. But it's possible that some DPP supporters, especially some of the more strongly anti-China, the kind of Sinophobic wing of the DPP, may have not turned out in large numbers, perhaps to kind of send their message to Tsai Ing-wen that she hasn't done enough for their end of the political spectrum. So I don't know about that one, but that actually seems plausible to me because Tsai Ing-wen has been criticized since before she won in 2016 by the so-called deep green faction or tendency in the DPP. And they have been merciless in her presidency, criticizing her. So it seems logical to me that they might have also contributed to this result by not turning out, not working as hard as they needed to in order to turn out the DPP vote.
Will this dissatisfaction with President Tsai extend to perhaps a deep green politician challenging her for the nomination for 2020?
I think that absolutely could happen at this point. The lesson that I'm gradually learning about the deep greens is that they never give up, right? They never learn the lesson of an election. They just think somebody else didn't do enough. Somebody else didn't try hard enough. If only you put the right package of deep green proposals before the electorate, they would see the light and we would be swept into office. The fact that the DPP was swept into office, winning the presidency and a majority in the legislature from a very weak position in the legislature prior to the 2016 elections, the fact that that happened in the 2016 elections on a moderate DPP platform seems not to have affected the thinking of the Deep Greens much. So while it would make sense to me that Tsai would be challenged by a lighter green candidate from the DPP, I don't think that will happen. But a deep green challenger may very well appear. And people who follow American politics understand the internal dynamics of party nominating procedures well enough to know that, a more radical version of, or a more ideological version of the party's agenda is likely to do well in an internal party process, even if that's catastrophic for the election. So that's something that might happen. And so the window may still be open for Ko-Wen-je in 2020.
Taiwan's deep greens remind me of the US Democratic Party during the 1980s, where there was a feeling that we just were not being true to our values, and if we only focused on ideological purity, the voters would come around. but they never did. Um, so it seems like for the presidential election in 2020, it really is very hard to predict at this point what the implications are. Could be a very open field.
Yes, I think so. It's still hard to know what the KMT will do. And I'm sure that they are right now just kind of trying to take in and understand what just happened for them, because this is a huge comeback, a huge opportunity for the KMT. But the KMT has blown a lot of big opportunities in the past. And what I really think needs to happen, and I think the kinds of candidates who were successful in this election are the kind of candidates that the KMT needs to rely on more going forward. But will the KMT take that lesson, or will they say, aha, you see, we still can win, so we're going to keep doing things the same old way? And the same old way that I think is most concerning for the KMT kind of taking this ball and running with it is to assume that picking from the top of the tree where the fruit is, shall we say, ripest in the KMT is the way to go. When I really think what the electorate is asking for are new people, new politicians, people like Ko Wen-je, people like Han Kuo-yu. I know Han Kuo-yu is not a new politician, but he presented himself in this election as something new and different. And there is a younger generation in the KMT. The fact that Ding did as well as he did in Taipei, it's an opportunity for the KMT to set aside everybody's got to wait their turn, and everything has to happen in order, and let some of this new blood really run. Will they do that? They never have before, so we'll have to wait and see.
You suggested that perhaps China would overinterpret the results of this election. What do you think China might do to try and influence the political situation in Taiwan in the run-up to the 2020 presidential election?
Right. So one thing that they'll very likely do in Beijing is to kind of offer some selective benefits to the specific municipalities that have elected KMT executives. Those KMT executives have all pretty much said, we're comfortable with the 92 consensus, which is the mantra that one must recite at the moment in order to be welcomed by the PRC government. So there are ways that beneficial policies like opening the door to tourism, purchasing more exports from Taiwan, especially agricultural exports. There are ways that those kinds of policies can, at least on the surface, be targeted to specific municipalities. And I'm sure that people in Beijing are already tinkering with their approach to figure out how to do that. I think also they will hammer away at the message that this election means that people don't want Tsai Ing-wen, that people do want a more Sinophilic kind of government in Taipei. And there's where I think they're likely over-interpreting. I mean, I think people are asking for a moderate approach, and that's completely predictable and typical. The other thing they may do, and I think this would be really regrettable, is to conclude that their policy of squeezing Taiwan in terms of international space, but also in terms of kind of escalating the threat level toward Taiwan has been effective. I don't think people voted the way they did because they're scared and they want to curry favor with Beijing, but this is the kind of result that those policies were intended to achieve. And I would hate to think that this would encourage Beijing to squeeze even tighter, because I think ultimately the tight squeeze backfires. but I could well understand why they might take that lesson from this result.
You've done a really deep dive into these elections and what it means and what it doesn't mean. I wonder, in conclusion, if you could say a few words about what this election means for Taiwan's democracy.
I think I'm going to make a lot of people unhappy right now, but I think it's a good thing for Taiwan's democracy that there is a robust two-party system. You know, after every big turning point election, so in 2000, the KMT was declared dead. In 2008, the DPP was declared dead. In 2016, the KMT was declared dead again. When will we learn that both of these are viable parties? And why are they both viable parties? Because Taiwan's electorate wants a choice. And we have to respect that. That is what democracy is about, is having a choice. And what the parties need to do is they need to adjust their positions to reflect the preferences of the electorate and not try to lead the electorate too far or too hard. They also need to take responsibility for leading when they are in power. So, for example, I think the DPP could have avoided the debacle with marriage equality by pushing through a marriage equality law when they had the chance right after the 2016 election, when there was a lot of energy for it. They had the majority in the legislature. They could have done it then, and they kind of they backed off because they weren't sure that it would be popular. Well, now they can't satisfy anybody, right? So there's a lot to be said for a two-party system or a multi-party system, but Taiwan's institutions are set up to encourage a two-party system where voters have a choice. I think that there will be a lot of concern voiced on the, what does this mean for Taiwan's democracy front by those who say the PRC interfered in the election. And there is definitely some truth to that. They delivered a strong message. They were in the media. They probably were putting stuff on social media for the candidate in Kaohsiung, certainly, and they were probably playing in Taiwan's real media and also social media a lot. However, this was a very high voter turnout. People knew what they were voting for, and they went out and voted. And so it's still a democratic outcome. And it's not only, the last point I would make on this issue is, it's not only the PRC that interfered in this election. US-based anti-marriage equality organizations also interfered in this election by flooding Taiwan's conservative, anti-gay forces with money, with ideas, with their ability to mobilize people against gay rights. So, we're going to criticize the PRC for being in Taiwan's media and social media to influence this election. I think at least on the marriage equality referendums, we need to also acknowledge that there are plenty of other global forces that are messing around in other countries' politics, and we shouldn't just look at China on this particular front.
Shelley Rigger, thank you very much for helping us understand Taiwan's politics and what it means for all of us. We look forward to talking to you again.
Thanks very much. I'm just glad to be with you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.